Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to my session. So I'm going to present this paper about cross-country analysis of women's participation in labor force and political presentation in the Middle East. But first, I would like to thank Pixel for organizing this wonderful event with so many diversified papers and interesting topics that I learned a lot during the past 2 days. And I would appreciate very much for the organizer. I also like to say a few words about myself. I am, as you can see, I'm Nahid Anaraki, and I have been teaching in different countries from US, Iran, China, and France. And my expertise is finance and economics, but I was very interested in women empowerment and to see why women are underrepresented in the Middle East, in labor force, and also in politics. So I carried out this research to see what's going on, and that is what motivated me to do this. I'm going to share my analysis with you. Okay. So women have limited access to economy and politics in the Middle East and North Africa region. And even countries with modern legislation and institutions, still women cannot be presented equal to men. And there are different reasons for this that we'll discuss in more detail. But I can say traditions and culture, patriarchal, inegalitarian culture, all of those factors have been contributing to the low participation of women in the labor force and politics. So this study is a quantitative study which implements regression models. I'm not sure how many of you have done econometrics model and are familiar with that, but I'm using a quantitative approach and econometric models to see what are the factors that has affected the women participation in labor force and in politics. So first of all, women in Middle East have been doing much worse than other countries, even than other developing countries. For example, the participation rate of women in Middle East is 33%, while the participation rate in the world is 55%. And that is a huge gap between the participation rate of women in Middle East and the rest of the world. So it shows that there is something going on, and only 17% of entrepreneurs are women in Middle East. So I'm going to discuss a little bit of literature review and then theoretical framework, data and methodology, estimated econometric model result, and some conclusions. One of the studies that have focused on women's education is Kalbasi and Pereira and Bamel, who their studies shows that women development have had many constraints in Middle East, and the inequality in the gender has created a lag in the participation in labor force. So, for example, number of women entrepreneurs in MENA region is lagging compared to other developing countries. And Basin Metcalfe and Zali has a study on those topics. There are several other topics that have shown the low participation rate of women in politics. And you can see that women in MENA region, for example, in Egypt, there is no governor, there is no female governor. In Iraq, after the war, states there is no women participation in the government, or there are a few number in the parliament. So there are several barriers to the women participation in that region, and that has created a huge cost of $575 billion due to the gender gap in Middle East, which is a huge loss to the economy of the region and has a negative impact on the women in that region. I will test three hypotheses here. Does education matter for participation in labor force and political representation? Does corruption matter for the female participation in labor force and representation in polity? Has Arab Spring exacerbated the degree of women participation in labor force and representation in the political system? So those are the topics, hypotheses that will be tested. In this study, we have covered 12 countries. The reason that I covered only 12 countries is that data is not available for all countries. For example, for Syria, for Iran, for a lot of countries, there is no data, continuous data available. For example, after each 5 years, there is one data, and you cannot use that for econometric models. So the sample countries that I have used here are Afghanistan, Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Morocco, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Tunisia. 12 countries, and the data covers period of 2005 through 2020, and most of the data is retrieved from the World Bank website and also Congressional Budget Office and International Transparency. The data on corruption has been retrieved from International Transparency. So I use those three hypotheses to test the econometric model, but how did I get to this point that corruption matters for women participation in labor force or in polity? So I was studying the literature, and I came across some interesting studies, such as those by Dollar, Bisman, and Gotti, who find that greater representation of women in parliament, the lower the level of corruption. Also, Swami et al. Find that women are less involved in bribery and corrupted behavior. Another study by Samimi et al. Used panel data for the period of 2003 up to 2010 for 27 countries, and they find that women participation in labor force has decreased corruption substantially. So the higher the level of women participation in the labor force, the lower the level of corruption. Also, Bishara, 2011, find in a more corrupted society, there is less chance for women to participate in the labor force. So one of the main reasons that we see lower participation rate in the Middle East is the corrupted governments that have reduced the amount of resources and opportunities for women, and that is an important constraint for women in the Middle East. So I use a fixed effect model, and I have used education, corruption, and a series of control variables that I have here, the list of variables. So you can see FLP represents female labor force participation, and female political representation as a dependent variable, and independent variables are education and corruption score. And I have two dummy variables, Jasmine Revolution, countries that experience the Arab Spring or Jasmine Revolution. We use dummy one. And then countries that have experienced post-war state, for example, Iraq or Algeria or Afghanistan, like countries like that I have used dummy variables for post-war state. And then control variables include GDP growth, budget deficit, per capita loan, and financial development. So I controlled for those variables to make sure that we see whether corruption is an important factor in affecting the female participation in labor force and also in politics. The estimated results show that coefficient of education to participation in labor force is estimated around 0.34. And the coefficient on corruption is negative, which shows that the higher the level of corruption, the lower the level of participation in the labor force. So it reduces the amount of participation by 0.12%. And consistent with Bishara, in 2011, we find in a more corrupted society, there is less chance for women to participate in the labor force. The reason is that in more corrupted societies, there will be less resources available for private sector, for entrepreneurs, and for women in general to participate in economic activities. So that is one of the main reasons that we see lower participation rate in labor force in Middle East. Also, the coefficient on the dummy variable for Jasmine Revolution or Arab Spring is negative, which shows that that revolution has exacerbated the situation of women in that region. And that is consistent with other studies such as Shamlu and Parshanas 2016 and Batal Oglu and Fassin in 2017. So the post-Arab Spring states are more conservative now, and they are giving less opportunities to women to participate in politics or in labor force. And finally, the coefficient on the second dummy variable, post-war states, or D2, is negative and statistically significant, highlighting the post-war states have had a worsened situation for women participation in the labor market. Indeed, post-war states such as Iraq, Algeria, or Afghanistan have had much more difficult time for women to participate in the labor force and in the politics. There is less representation in the parliament, lower number of women in the government, and all those factors are due to either corruption or the Arab Spring, and also dependent on the post-war states. The elasticity of women's seats held in the parliament to education is estimated around 0.12%, which indicates 1% increase in the number of females in tertiary education will increase women's participation in the parliament by 0.12%, and the elasticity of female participation in polity to corruption is negative and equal to 0.17%, which indicates 1% increase in the corruption level reduces the level of women participation in the parliament by 0.17%, which is a significant reduction. Also, the dummy variable for the Arab Spring is negative and statistically significant, indicating that Arab Spring has had a negative impact on the women participation, political representation, and D2 is also negative, statistically significant, indicating that women in post-Arab states such as Afghanistan, Algeria, and Iraq have experienced lower participation in the parliament, not only in the labor force, but also in the parliament. Indeed, one of the reasons that Arab Spring was not successful in that region was that the democratization was replaced by other measures, was replaced by security cooperation, anti-terrorism measures, and other political events that reduce the level of democratization and participation of women. So women empowerment was jeopardized by the security cooperation and anti-terrorism measures that allocated a lot of budget to those measures compared to the women participation in the labor force. And this replacement had had severe negative consequences for women in the Middle East and on their political and economic activities. Finally, the coefficient on control variables such as GDP growth, budget deficit, per capita loan, and financial development are not statistically significant, indicating that women's participation in the parliament have not been shaped by orthodox macroeconomic fundamentals. Rather, it has been shaped by the level of corruption and education. So those two factors are the main variables that affect the level of participation compared to other economic variables such as GDP growth or financial development. So if I want to sum up this paper, we find that corruption plays a detrimental role in women's participation in both labor force participation and in parliament participation. Therefore, anti-corruption measures should be at the center of attention, not only by the government of the Middle East, but also by the foreign governments that give loans or foreign aid to those countries. It should be conditional to the anti-corruption measures, because right now a lot of aid goes from US or from European countries to Middle East countries without any conditionality, and those funds goes to other activities rather than women empowerment or rather than creating more job opportunities for women in Middle East. So that is something that should be cared of, and politicians need to be aware of that. And we found that Jasmine Revolution has had negative impact on women participation, both on labor force and political representation. We find that orthodox macroeconomic fundamentals do not matter for women participation. Being in a post-war state has more importance than other macroeconomic fundamentals. So the dummy variables are more significant compared to the macroeconomic fundamentals. So that's my presentation. Thank you for attention.